So you're learning Dutch, but you're probably asking yourself, am I doing the right things and am I studying in the most efficient way possible? I've been learning Dutch now for more than 4 years, and in this video I'm going to break down year by year in detail exactly what I did, every resource that I used, and which ones I think helped me the most. Please steal these ideas by all means. I hope it will give you some ideas in your language learning process and also give you the confidence to know that what you're doing is actually going to work. If that sounds good to you, grab something to take some notes and let's get right into it. Just to give some structure to this video, I'm going to be breaking down every year into a few different categories. So I'll be discussing exactly what I did year by year to learn Dutch in terms of formal learning, so courses that I took, apps and websites that I used, podcasts that I listened to, YouTube channels that I followed, books that I read, and movies and shows that I watched. This video is just an account of everything that I did, so by no means am I saying you need to do all these things if you want to learn Dutch, but maybe it will give you some ideas for things that might work for you along the way in your process. I think everyone learns differently, and if I could go back, I would do some things differently as well. In the future, I definitely want to make some videos about mistakes that I've made along the way and things that I would have done differently, so definitely consider subscribing if that's something you think you'd be interested in. Year one for me was the year 2020, but to be completely fair to the story, we actually have to rewind like 4 to 6 months before I moved to the Netherlands, which was somewhere mid-2019, because this is when I actually started to learn Dutch. Once I knew for sure that I'd be moving to the Netherlands, I wanted to get a bit of a head start because I knew I'd be moving to the country and I wanted to have some basics before I got there. At that time, there was only one language learning app that I was familiar with, and that was Duolingo. I'd used Duolingo in the past to learn some Spanish for traveling, so I was familiar with the app itself. So like I said, I think I started with the Duolingo Dutch course about 4 to 6 months before I actually moved to the Netherlands. I had never studied any Dutch before. The only language that I had ever officially studied was French in school, which, by the way, I cannot speak anymore, which is really disheartening. But anyway, that gave me somewhat of a framework for learning a language, I think. At this point, I didn't really have a plan. I think I just thought I'm gonna start with the Duolingo Dutch course and see where it takes me. I think I had heard somewhere that the desktop version of Duolingo was a lot better than the mobile version in terms of like grammar explanations, so I almost exclusively used the desktop version of Duolingo back then in the beginning. So I started off from the very beginning of the course. I didn't skip anything. I started off with grammar topic 1, and for every single grammar topic that I came across, I would make my own handwritten notes to make sure that I fully understood everything before I would move on to the next topic. I think conjugation of verbs was the first grammar topic, which luckily I was familiar with from learning French, so I knew and understood the importance of that. So I made my own little handwritten notes on hebben and zijn, and I basically just memorized that right off of the bat. So I slowly went through the beginning of the course this way. Some days I would do a few different new grammar lessons, and some days I would try to learn multiple grammar topics at once, and other days I would just go through my practice, like reviewing the grammar lessons that I had done in the days before. And I actually learned a lot of like basic vocabulary this way, just doing the Duolingo course. The Duolingo grammar lessons back in mid-2019 were not as extensive as I think they are now. So I often had to rely on like online resources and other websites to kind of like supplement my grammar notes. So for this, I mainly used the website dutchgrammar.com. To this day, I think this is probably the most comprehensive Dutch grammar resource that's online. Being a big consumer of YouTube, I also found it really helpful to follow along some YouTube channels to help me with my understanding of Dutch grammar. At that time, my absolute favorite YouTube channel was Learn Dutch with Niels. If I'm not mistaken, he's an actual teacher, so his explanations of the grammar were really on point, really easy to understand, and he gave amazing examples in his videos. The channel Learn Dutch with Kim was also starting out at that time. It's obviously huge now, but when I first started, it was just getting up and running. I also found her channel really helpful and really supported me in my understanding of Dutch grammar. And her channel was amazing for my Dutch comprehension because she speaks really clearly in her videos. But going back to Duolingo, the app back then was obviously a lot different than it is now. All of the audio samples were like a very robotic AI voice, and I remember missing stories. So if you've ever done the Duolingo Spanish course, or maybe there are some other courses that have this feature as well, but they're like practice conversations where you see
two sides of a conversation happening, and you sometimes have to like fill in the next line of the conversation to see if you understood the context of what was going on. I really liked this feature because it featured really simple vocabulary and things that you've learned in previous lessons. It also gave that feeling of progress in the early stages of like, wow, I'm actually understanding what's going on here. Unfortunately, the Dutch course didn't have that, but I really was looking for something I could listen to where I could understand spoken Dutch, but it had to be something really for beginners. So I thought listening to podcasts for Dutch beginners would be a good place to start with my comprehension of Dutch. The first podcast that I came across was called Dutch Pod 101. This was a good basic first podcast. You heard a lot of like simple conversations, like introductions and very easy exchanges, and I think this was a great first podcast to start out with. Eventually that became a little bit repetitive for me, and I found the podcast Zeg het in het Nederlands. This is an excellent Dutch learning podcast. She speaks really clearly and slowly. She doesn't necessarily teach you Dutch grammar, but she teaches you about like Dutch holidays and culture, traditions, and speaks in a way that an absolute beginner can start to understand Dutch. I would listen to the same episode several times. Not necessarily on the same day, but I would listen to an episode maybe like 4 to 5 times and try to pick up new things every single time that I listened to it. So this was like a very active exercise. I wasn't just putting it on in the background. I was sitting down, trying to understand as much as I could and writing down the things that I didn't understand so that I could look them up afterwards. I really highly recommend these beginner podcasts for you if you're in the early stages of learning Dutch. If you've already learned some basic vocabulary and you know a little bit and understand the grammar a little bit, I think you'd be pleasantly surprised by just how much you understand when you hear Dutch being spoken in a very slow and controlled way. And this understanding in the beginning is the motivation that I think we all need to keep going and to keep improving with our Dutch. After a few months of doing everything that I was doing, I decided I wanted to enroll myself in a Dutch course for when I finally was physically in the Netherlands. And because of everything I had been doing, I was feeling a little bit confident, and I thought, okay, maybe I can apply for the A1 to A2 course instead of the A0 to A1 course, which is for absolute complete beginners. So the Dutch school asked me to schedule an intake call with them, and this is just where they like have a quick conversation with you to see if you are enrolling yourself in the correct level. So I had a call with the owner, and he spoke, of course, to me in Dutch, and I had to answer some questions, which went okay, but I couldn't really respond that well to the questions where I had to answer in the past tense. So he ended up asking me to enroll in the A0 complete beginner course. Okay, now we can fast forward to the day I landed at Schiphol, because this is coincidentally also my first day of Dutch in-person classes. Yes, I'm a little bit crazy, but it just so happened that that was the first day of the course, and I didn't want to wait like the few weeks it took for the next round of courses to start. I'm not going to focus too much on the courses because I know a lot of you are doing this on your own, and courses can be extremely expensive, but if you're fortunate enough to have your Dutch courses covered by your work or school like I was, then this information about the courses might come in handy for you. So I was enrolled at Dutch Courses Amsterdam in Old West, which, by the way, I can highly recommend. They were great. This was a 7-week course with 2 2-hour lessons per week. And this was in early 2020, so I was physically going there and doing all of my lessons in person. In my experience, the best things about a proper course are: 1, the instructor speaks to you in Dutch almost the entire time. So you get tons of practice, not only being spoken to, but you get to practice trying to respond to someone in Dutch as well. And it's a lot less stress than being out in public and doing it in the wild. Number 2, you get a book or course material. So in my case, they gave us a binder which was full of material, and this is where all of our grammar lessons and all of our homework came from. They've obviously taught this level so many times, so they know exactly what the foundational grammar topics are and what things you should be learning at the very beginning so that you can slowly build up over time. And you don't have to figure out yourself what you should be learning as you go along. And number 3, you just get practice speaking with people who are at your level. So for me, speaking was the most difficult part of learning Dutch. Speaking to native speakers in stores or at my job in the first year was just not realistic. But I was a lot more comfortable speaking with the people in my class who were also at my level. Another thing that this course offered was flashcards. So part of the homework was to learn a bunch of different sets of flashcards, which they thought were most important for absolute beginners. This included common verbs, basic vocabulary, question words, and common Dutch phrases or idioms. And they used an app called Quizlet for this. So they provided all the students with ready-made flashcard sets on Quizlet. I really like the flashcard method. It's something that for me really works well. And you can always just practice while you're like taking the tram on the way to work or when you have some downtime. It's just really accessible and really easy to do. So aside from going to my weekly lessons, I was religiously doing my homework, of course, using the app to practice my flashcards, and I was listening to as many podcasts, like beginner podcasts, as I could with all of my free time. So after the A0, A1 course that I took, I immediately enrolled myself in the A1, A2 course because I didn't want to lose out on the momentum that I had going. At this point, I was barely ever speaking Dutch in the real world. One thing I did learn to do in Dutch, though, was place my order at Febo, which is a like fast food chain that was down the street from where I lived. So I would go there, I would place my order in Dutch, really proud, and that would go completely fine, but they would ask me a question in Dutch and I would have to switch to English because I didn't fully understand. And this happened for literally weeks on end until I figured out like all of the different possible questions they could ask me, which were like, do you want a bag? Are you eating here or is it to go? Do you want sauce with your fries, etc., etc. So I had to go through that process for months until I could finally do the entire exchange completely in Dutch. So in the A1, A2 course, I feel like this is where you started to get the actual key grammar that you need to have like a good basic beginner conversation in Dutch. So the flashcards at this stage were covering topics, for example, like irregular verbs, past tense in both forms, separable verbs, which absolutely suck, and telling the time, for example. I don't remember if it was my teacher at the school or if it was something I saw online, but I got a tip that as I was going through my flashcards, I should practice my verbs in all tenses. So if the verb blijven came up or to stay, then I would have to say what it meant, the infinitive form, and then the past tense forms. So it would be like, okay, I see to stay, blijven, bleef, bleven, gebleven. Yeah, I think just really focusing on the most common Dutch verbs and really practicing those is really actually pretty key at this stage. My Dutch teachers really recommended us watching as much Dutch television as possible, and I'm now also a huge proponent of this. One of the things they recommended to us in the beginning was the show First Dates. So this is a show which is on NPO 3, I think. It's on every single day, 5 days a week at 7:25. I watched this a lot, so I still remember. And it's just a dating show where people sign up and they basically get matched with a blind date. The entire date is filmed. They meet their blind date at the First Dates restaurant and they have their date. And then at the end of the episode, they both sit in front of the camera and they have to say whether or not they want to see the other person again. This is actually pretty good for beginners because on all these dates, you kind of have like a repetition of the same questions. It's like, what are your hobbies? Do you have family? Where are you from? What do you do for work? Where do you live? And coincidentally, if you are new in the Netherlands or Belgium, you also will get these questions a lot. So it really helps to hear how people answer them and kind of like just get used to the different possible ways that it can be asked. But beyond that, it's just two people having a conversation, and for the absolute beginner, that can just be really hard to keep up with and follow. So I did watch a lot of First Dates in the beginning, but if I want to admit to you what was my actual speed in terms of watching Dutch TV, it was Nijntje. Nijntje is the main character of a children's television show in the Netherlands, and I would literally watch episodes of Nijntje and try to transcribe the audio, so like try to write down everything I heard in the episode to practice with my comprehension of spoken Dutch. So what I would do, I would find an episode of Nijntje, I would play a few sentences, press pause, and then I would write down everything I thought I heard. If there were words in there that I didn't know already, then I would have to translate them and figure out what they were in English. And then when the few sentences that I had written down, when I completely understood everything there, then I would press play again and keep doing that with another 2 sentences and go on and on and on like this. It sounds like a lot of effort, and it was, but Nijntje is actually like a show for really young kids. So the episodes that I was watching were about like shapes and colors and numbers and things like that. So for a beginner, like, it's actually quite doable. And with a show as simple as Nijntje, trust me, it won't be long before you can understand like most, if not all, of the words in a single episode. Next to that, I just stayed consistent on Duolingo doing my daily lessons. Sometimes if I was feeling really ambitious, I would do like 5 or 10 lessons in a single day, also continuing to make my grammar notes, but other days I would just do my 1 practice lesson and get it out of the way. Now, obviously, you can get pretty sick of watching kids shows all the time, so it was nice to now and then mix in like some normal shows and movies. I watched a bunch in the first year. I'll put them on screen, but I won't specifically recommend these ones that I watched, I guess, in the sense that I do think they helped me in the grand scheme of things. Like, no matter what Dutch you're listening to, I think it does help with your understanding, but it's not like I watched these in the first year and could follow along by any means without English subtitles. Definitely watch Dutch shows and movies in the first year with like your native language subtitles to get used to practicing hearing and understanding Dutch, but just pick something that you personally like and that you can stick with. I did not read any books in my first year, but my boyfriend's mom gave me the book Jouw Eerste 1000 Woorden, which is exactly what it sounds like. And this was obviously like super helpful to learn really basic common vocabulary. So year 2, the year is 2021. And if you remember what was going on at that time, there were no in-person Dutch courses to be found. But it had been months since I had taken my last course, and I really wanted to get started on my formal learning again. My coworker recommended Bart de Pauw's Dutch Grammar 2, which is an online video course she had taken, and I decided to look into what it was all about and see if it was something for me. It actually lined up quite well with the level I was at the time, so I decided to invest in that course and take it from home. So this course focused on future tense, past tense, conjunctions, and the ever important error. So I would watch every single video lesson. There were more than 40 in the course. I would do all of my homework questions, and then for every grammar topic, I would write 10 of my own sentences to show that I understood the topic that was just taught. This process actually really helped me with my Dutch vocabulary, because when you're writing that many sentences and you have like a limited Dutch vocabulary, you actually have to start looking up new words so that you can make like new, fresh sentences. Then I would ask my boyfriend, who's Dutch, by the way, to review my sentences so I could see where all the mistakes I made were and how to correct those. That course was extremely helpful for me, so I decided to go on to take his Dutch Grammar 3, which is the most advanced grammar course that he offers. And it's meant for people who have at least an A2 B1 level, just to give an idea of where I was at the time. Now, in terms of what I was doing at home, I tried to speak Dutch with my boyfriend as much as possible, but honestly, it was just pretty frustrating when I was at this intermediate level. Like, despite the fact that my grammar understanding was pretty good, my vocabulary was okay, my speaking was obviously lagging a bit behind, and I think that's pretty normal, but it's hard to have an entire relationship this way. Like, you just end up going back to English most of the time. So I started looking into some ways that I could get this speaking practice in, but ideally with someone who had like some professional experience and could give me some like specific guidance and advice. So then I stumbled upon italki, which is an online platform, and there you can find both professional teachers who speak your target language, but you can also find community tutors. So these are just people who sign up, they speak your target language, and they can help you either just with practicing your speaking, or if you have a specific goal in the target language, like taking a specific test in that language. And I really like the platform because you can find someone on there who charges anywhere from like €5 an hour to €80 an hour. So depending on your budget, you can really decide who to book a call with based on what you can afford. So at that point, I thought the best way I could invest my money was to take some conversation practice calls on italki and really get that like speaking practice in with a real native speaker and get like personalized feedback from them. I tried a few different teachers and formats, but what I ended up finding was that a 30-minute call once per week was a good rhythm for me, and I did this around like 10 to 15 times, so I think like around 10 to 15 weeks in total. It might not sound like a lot, but I have to say this really, really helped my spoken Dutch because I wasn't at the point then when I was speaking Dutch at work, so I wasn't getting a ton of conversation practice in. But after these 10 to 15 italki conversation practice calls, I really felt like my spoken Dutch had gotten a boost. One of the tutors that I used the textbook Zichtbaar Nederlands, which is this book right here, and I can really, really highly recommend this book if you're at the A2, B1 level. It has really nice grammar explanations, nice illustrations, nice tables, so it's really easy to follow along. And coincidentally, I actually had bought that book before I even started taking the conversation lessons on italki because my coworker had recommended it to me and she also found it really great. In the meantime, I was reading some very, very easy Dutch books to help with my comprehension. One of the books I read at the time was called Ik ben ook op jou by Jacques Vriends, which is a book meant for children, I think aged 7 and up. Any book I would read, I would do with my Dutch-English dictionary by my side. So any word that I didn't know, I would look up right away and I would write it down by hand in my little notebook because personally this really helped me remember the words for next time. At this time, I was still really regularly watching Learn Dutch with Kim for the grammar topics that I needed some assistance with. And I got more into vlogs around this time. So I really liked the vlogs of Elisa Boers, Vita Cleo, Teska, and Monica Geuze. And in terms of more like comedy entertainment videos, I really liked Rijk Hofman for this. It wasn't so much of like an active exercise like the Nijntje episodes where I would try to transcribe anything or write anything down. It was more just to like actively listen and get practice with my understanding. And actually, I still love all of these channels with the exception of Monica Geuze. She doesn't post vlogs anymore, but I still watch all of these channels to this day. So in year 2, this was actually the year I started to move away from beginner learn Dutch podcasts to like normal Dutch podcasts, which are meant for Dutch-speaking people in general. The one that seemed to stick for me was a podcast called Mark, Marie, and Aaf Vinden Iets. You won't be able to find this exact podcast anymore because Mark Marie, that is, he now has a new co-host. So if you want to check this podcast out, you have to search for Mark Marie and Isa Vinden Iets. And the reason I loved this podcast is because they just talk about like ridiculously simple topics. I mean, like cats, flowers, Germany, the supermarket, like really basic things that everyone knows about. And then they just talk about like the do's and don'ts, if they have like a funny anecdote around that topic, and then at the end they'd give it a rating out of 5. Then there's also NOS Jeugdjournaal, which is like a news podcast for kids between 9 and 12. It's been around for like more than 35 years. And obviously because of the target age group that they make the podcast for, it's also quite good for beginner intermediate Dutch speakers as well. This one also is about relatively simple topics like taking tests at school or eating vegetables. So even if you don't understand every single word you hear, you can more or less follow along with the conversation. I also discovered the app Memrise in my second year, which was really nice to switch things up from Duolingo, which I was still doing every single day at that point. I mainly studied the Dutch 5, Dutch 6, and Dutch 7 courses, which are available on the free version of the Memrise app. I actually don't think at that point I was learning any new grammar. Not to say that there was not more grammar for me to learn, but I had learned everything that I felt was important for me to have like a basic conversation at the upper intermediate level. And I didn't feel like learning more complex grammar would necessarily be of value for me at that point. So Memrise for me was just kind of like a new tool which helped me break free from the like monotony of Duolingo every day. And I did learn some new vocabulary and some new Dutch phrases and idioms. And when you do use the same method every single day, you can get pretty fatigued by that. So it was really nice to switch things up. Year 3. So in year 3, I was getting a lot more confident in my abilities to speak and understand Dutch. At work, I was attending meetings that were fully spoken in Dutch. I would usually respond in English when I was asked a question, because while my like at home Dutch was getting pretty good, I didn't have all the necessary technical terms that I needed to have a conversation at work about work. I would say in a meeting, like a work meeting, I would understand like around 80% of what everyone was saying. One thing that I did at work, which I think was really, really key, is I had some speaking partners at work who I would only speak Dutch with. So I had a lot of coworkers that I spoke English with, but there were some people who were clearly way more comfortable speaking Dutch, and I kind of gravitated towards those people to be my Dutch speaking partners. For the record, I never went into work and was like, hey guys, I'm speaking Dutch from now on, because that's totally not my thing. But finding these people who were more comfortable in Dutch was like the perfect solution for me, because they were also very happy to help me practice. Towards the end of year 3, I was reading books for kids aged like 9, 10, 11. So growing up, I really loved the books of Roald Dahl, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Matilda, The Witches. So I really gravitated towards those books in Dutch because I already knew the storyline. So I knew if I read them in Dutch that I would at least kind of know what was going on if I didn't understand every single word. So that year I read some Roald Dahl books. I read Matilda and I read Dansje de Wereldkampioen. Don't get me wrong, I was not reading these books with ease. I was still reading with my dictionary at hand, looking up every single word I didn't know. What's a bit of a shame is that a lot of those books have a lot of old language in them. So like a lot of old Dutch, which is not as commonly used anymore. I specifically remember reading Dansje de Wereldkampioen on a long car ride with my boyfriend and his family. And that was really convenient because if I didn't know a word, I could just ask everyone in the car what the word meant. But I specifically remember there being many words where I would ask and they would say, oh, but that's like a really old word. No one uses that anymore. Or sometimes they wouldn't even really know the word themselves. I'm personally not so interested in learning those words that I'm never going to use or that no one else uses. So I basically just like forgot those, like didn't write them down in my notebook and just moved on to the next one. In terms of what I watched in that third year, that actually brings up a really fun kind of challenge that I had in year 3, which ended up being like a huge project in learning Dutch. In the Netherlands, you occasionally come across a show or movie on Netflix which does not have English subtitles. That ended up being the case for the show The Bridge, which is a Swedish drama series with 4 seasons. My boyfriend and I were recommended this show many, many times, and it's only spoken in Swedish and Danish. But there were no English subtitles. There were only Dutch subtitles. And I didn't want to not watch the show. So this ended up being a 4-season long process of reading Dutch subtitles and trying to figure out this show. It was actually a success, I have to say. I'm pretty proud of myself. Like, I obviously couldn't understand everything because the show follows around 2 detectives who are always like busy trying to solve like these really complex cases. So in terms of terminology, there were plenty of things that I didn't understand right off the bat, but overall it was a success. I'm actually pleasantly surprised by how well it went. By the way, loved that show. Highly recommend. Okay, that takes us to 2023, year 4. I started a new job, and on the first day, my boss asked me whether we would be doing the training in English or Dutch. I obviously said Dutch, and because of that, I honestly think this moment was the cause for a huge leap in my Dutch over the next year. From that moment on, I've done my best to speak Dutch to my coworkers and my clients. Of course, it doesn't always go according to plan, but it gets so much easier the more I'm exposed to all the vocabulary. The hardest part for me was getting used to the technical vocabulary because I work as an accountant, and finance and accounting is just not really something I talk about in my daily life. So I didn't have the vocab, but I was lucky enough to be offered 10 private lessons in business Dutch. So in professional communication, writing emails in Dutch and this kind of thing. And this turned out to be super valuable for me. For this, we used the textbook Nederlands op niveau. I think I'm just really lucky because for 8 or more hours a day, I'm constantly exposed to the language and terminology that I'm trying to learn. And I try to get as much out of that as possible. Like, I know some people will try to block it out. I'm honestly sitting there, I'm doing the complete opposite. I'm a very active listener when I'm at the office. I'm listening to how people start and end their phone calls. I'm listening to the words they use most often. I always have DeepL open somewhere in the background in a tab so that I can quickly translate a word that I hear in the background. At this point, when my coworkers use some like obscure or funny Dutch word, they always ask me if I know it because I've told them before that I learn at least 1 or 2 new Dutch words a day at the office. So they're also on the lookout for like, oh, what's your Dutch word of the day going to be today? This is honestly where I learned the Dutch that I could never learn from a course. It's the Dutch that people are just using amongst each other every single day, not what you learn from a book. I'm still regularly following like all the channels that I watched 2 years ago when I was learning Dutch. And obviously that's not because I want to practice my Dutch anymore. It's just become part of my routine. On the other hand, I do think it still has a positive impact on my Dutch. Probably one of my proudest moments last year was in May of last year when I attended the stand-up comedy show of Daniel Arends in Utrecht. His show was called Thuis praat ik bijna nooit. The fact that I could sit there with like 800 other people laughing my ass off to this comedian who was speaking Dutch was like just the craziest, most remarkable feeling ever. Honestly, with learning Dutch, I just constantly have these moments of like, wow, I'm understanding all of this, or whoa, I just did that entire client call in Dutch. After 4 years, I still amaze myself with the fact that I can communicate with people in this language, which 10 years ago, I'm not even sure I knew what it sounded like. This year, I changed my Dutch proficiency on LinkedIn from limited working proficiency to professional working proficiency. So this is how I've assessed myself at this point, year 5 in my learning. Now, Duolingo has been on the list every year so far, and that is also 100% correct. I've used Duolingo since the very beginning of my Dutch learning journey, and I'm still using it every single day. In the beginning, it looked a lot different than it does now. Like back then, I was doing my own notes on the grammar lessons and doing multiple lessons a day. Nowadays, I just do a practice lesson to keep up my streak. To be honest, it doesn't have anything to do with learning Dutch anymore. It's just about keeping up like a daily habit around Dutch for me. One day I'll reveal my streak in a video because I have to admit it's pretty wild. I still have so much to learn when it comes to Dutch, but I plan on staying in the Netherlands, so technically I have the rest of my life to continue practicing, and I intend to do so. I'm just gonna keep speaking every single day and watching tons of Dutch content because that was obviously key in my ability to learn Dutch. If you haven't found some Dutch YouTube channels that you love yet, you need to do that ASAP because it's gonna do wonders for your Dutch. If you don't know where to start, check out this video next for my guide to Dutch YouTube.